welcome all of you to the very first roundtable discussion. Let me just briefly introduce the panelists. Me, myself, Dominik Mierzejewski, Jarosław Jura on my left, then Bartosz Kowalski from the University of UŁ, Jarek from Łazarskiego University, and thanks, Mario, for joining us. Can you hear us well? Yep. Mario from Madrid, and we 4 scholars working on one project that is the BRI in the Global South, more or less. So we're trying to identify China's presence in the Global South countries. This project is supported by National Science Center in Krakow. And since 2020, we're trying to identify 3 major pillars of China's behavior in a Global South, that is discursive power, elite diplomacy, and economic statecraft. And in today's short meeting, we will present not the final outcomes of our research, but rather preliminary. So we're working 4 years and we still are in a preliminary session. So it's more or less like China in a very initial stage of socialism. But let me just briefly introduce this project. As I mentioned, we're trying to identify the mechanism behind China's behavior. And discursive power is important because China tried to shape hearts and minds of different audiences. And today we will present China's narrative strategies towards different audiences, and also pro-China feelings and sentiments. And then, of course, utilize the multilateral platforms, because we're starting from the multilateral platforms and then we are debating bilateral relations. So discursive power is mainly discussed through the multilateral gatherings. Then we're debating bilateral relations with elite diplomacy and economic statecraft. We selected case study countries for this research. That is Thailand in Southeast Asia and Cambodia. In Africa, Kenya and South Africa. In Central Europe, Serbia and Poland. Then Latin America, Chile and Brazil. So we did study trips to all the countries. We interviewed, I don't know, more than 150 people on the occasion of relations with China. And as I said, today we will introduce the preliminary findings from the research. And this session is structured as follows. The first will be Jarek. We'll briefly introduce the methodology. This is a methodology guy in our group. Then I'm kindly asked Mario to share some findings from discursive power networks from China-Latin America relations. Then I will be back to Jarek with China-Africa. Then Bartek will introduce our findings from China-Central Europe. And finally, I will try to attract you with China-Southeast Asia relationship from these 2 perspectives. The first is discursive power, and the second is elite diplomacy or informal networks. And that is 2 mechanisms we'd like to introduce today. We are still working on economic statecraft, so it's still ahead of us. Jarek, now the floor is yours, please.
So a few general remarks about the methodology of the whole project, then a little bit more about this particular issues we are going to present today. So the project is, I would say, quite empirical. We mostly based on the 3 types of the data. First is the, let's say, analysis of the textual data. By the textual data, we mean, for example, analysis of the documents, analysis of the media articles. We will not present it today. Analysis of the content of the Chinese embassies, etc., etc. Then in-depth interviews, which already was mentioned by Dominik. So in each of our case studies country, we conducted more or less 20-something interviews. So it's more than 150 altogether. Those interviews were conducted mostly with the, I would say, elites rather. So it's like diplomats, scholars, journalists, policymakers, NGOs. in order to get some better insight into our case studies countries and conditions there. And then we also will employ, despite of the obviously literature review, some statistical data, but it will be not presented today. It will be rather for the economic stakeholders. So that's the type of the data we are using. Mostly it will be rather, let's say, qualitative analysis supported by some quantitative data. So in terms, for example, of the analysis of the documents in general, for example, today when we talk about discursive power, we talk about the analysis of about a little bit less than 90 documents which have been published on the occasions of the different formats we are talking about. So the CELAC +1, FOCAC, ASEAN +1, and 10 plus something, 10 and a little bit more +1. So because it's difficult for me to say it will be 16, 14, yeah, but it's changing all the time. So that's why I use this term. When we started, it was 17, that was 16, now it's 14. Yeah. So yeah, so that's the time frame for the analysis of those documents, which will be talked today. It's 2013, so the beginning of the BRI till 2022. As I already said, we analyzed altogether 87 documents. Mostly in, I would say, qualitative way, supported by some type of the quantitative data. In a matter of the fact, we just created some kind of the categorization models which are focusing on the keywords related to the particular issues we are interested in. In this particular case, it was issues related with something which we called historical reference, which appeared in these documents. Another type of the big category is related to something which we call China model. So in this China model, we introduce some subcategories which, as we do presume, are related to some issues which China would promote as their own solution. So it's not like they're using China model per se, but rather certain issues which we find as important for them. And then in the third part, we discuss the third categories related to the main frames of the reference, which have been used in those documents. By those main frames of the reference, in this particular case, I mean some issues like, for example, reference to some political issues, economic issues, security issues, etc., etc. And then we dig a little bit more into some of those. We'll describe it later on. So that's shortly about this analysis of the documents, and then very shortly about the second part. We'll talk about those analysis of the let's say people-to-people relations, interpersonal relations, or cultivation, however we call it, is based mostly on the literature review and the content of the in-depth interviews. So that's more or less everything about the methodology, and I think we can go to the call.
So Mario, please start your first intervention today.
Okay, thank you, Dominic. Can you hear me properly? Okay, good. So I'm going to share, well, my name is Mario Esteban, and I'm the director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the Autonomous University of Madrid. And now I'm going to try to present, let's see if it works. Let's see. Yes, it works, right? Okay, so let's go to the first. Why is? Okay, there's always these problems, with the PowerPoint. I'm seeing the first slide, but you are seeing another slide, don't you? You are seeing Salvador Allende now, right? On the screen. Can you hear me, guys?
Yeah, we see slide number 5. So.
Okay. Now I can work on that. Okay,
now
good.
It works.
Perfect.
Go ahead.
Okay, excellent. So, as I was saying, I work at the center. I'm director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the Autonomous University of Madrid, and my part in this project, of course, is related with China's engagement with Latin America. So that's what I'm going to present today regarding this discursive power and elite diplomacy of China in Latin America. Okay, so when it comes, to this this power of the narratives, official narrative of China, one of the main objectives of those narratives is building trust, is building trust. It's quite interesting, that in order to build that trust, Chinese authorities, they even create the myth of historical links, historical people-to-people, links between Chinese people, and Latin American people, And I like this example, this extract, for a speech, by Wang Yi, in the first ministerial meeting of the China-CELAC forum, where he talked about how Chinese ancestors, they had sailed across the Pacific, to trade products and advanced production techniques with the locals, so on and so forth, and how this contributed to the progress of human civilization. And probably he's referring, to the Manila Galleon, that was, Spanish Empire, enterprise, that connected the two sides of the Pacific for like 3 centuries, and connecting the Philippines, with Mexico, it's called New Spain at that time. But, nevertheless, he talked about this links, and he talked about this, he called it like ancient maritime Silk Road, like there was something, that was protagonized, by the Chinese people, with Latin American people. And of course, there was Chinese, people involved in this, and Chinese, of course, Chinese manufacturers, were directly involved in this, but the way he presented it, I think it's quite interesting, in order to create that kind of path, of interaction, between China and Latin America. It's also quite interesting, because in these official narratives, when they talk about the colonial era, and when they talk about how Chinese people supported Latin America people in the decolonization process, which is quite shocking, because most of the decolonization process of Latin America, took part in the early 19th century, right, when China was under the Qing dynasty. So, this is kind, of interesting way, of presenting that. To be fair, it's also important to underline that since the historical relations between China and Latin America were quite different during the colonial period and the imperialist era, if you want to call it later on, they were very different from the relationships with Southeast Asia or Africa, which we'll present it later. Of course, this part of the common history, is quite diluted when it comes, to official narratives for Chinese. China's official narrative with Latin America compared, with China's official narrative with Africa, or Asia. But nevertheless, they still put some of that narrative here. It's the same, when it comes to the Cold War era, again, it's also interesting because the influence of China or the Chinese help, in the fight against U.S. imperialism, in this case in Latin America, of course, is also quite. It's not that significant, because, as you know, the first government that supported that recognized China was Fidel Castro, but Fidel Castro, aligned with Moscow on the Sino-Soviet split, so it was more like Moscow influence in Latin America through Cuba, not Maoist China influence, Nevertheless, they talk about some of this brotherhood, during this fight against U.S. imperialism. Chile is a good example of what I mentioned, because, well, of course, you all know Allende, and Popular Unity, the platform, the party coalition that brought him to power, and as probably some of you know, the Chilean Communist Party was part of that platform, but Chilean Communist Party was again linked with the Soviet Union, and the Revolutionary Communist Party of Chile, he was Maoist party. He was critical, with Salvador Allende and Popular Unity, and this, Revolutionary Communist Party was the one actually supported by China at that time. Although, of course, later on when Allende, went to power, he recognized, the People's Republic of China, and he established, good political relations with China. But nevertheless, we don't have much time, so that's the reason, I'm just, being quite trying to be very short, in my comments. Maybe later on in the Q&A we can elaborate more. But nevertheless, I want to emphasize also one idea here, which is that when China presents nowadays its own success, the socioeconomic success, in Latin America, sometimes, they underline the role of socialism, which is not usually the case when they engage with other regions in which socialism, is not that popular. This is an extract of an interview, that Xi Jinping gave to media. I mean, it was for Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and Cuba, before a tour, that he conducted to these countries in 2014. As you can see there, he underlined also the role of socialism. He talked about the path of socialism with Chinese characteristic, as key, for the own success, socioeconomic success, of China, and this kind of rhetoric we don't find, as frequently, when China engaged with other regions, in the global South, in which socialism is not that influential. Of course, another significant part of this power narrative, is the South-South cooperation, and we can see here, also how this South-South cooperation is directly linked, with the Belt and Road Initiative, Of course, as you can imagine, this bold and italics letter, it was not like that in the original speech, just for clarity, I mean, for facilitating, a quick visualization of that, I put it that way. But you can see, that how this South-South cooperation is stressed, when it comes to China-Latin American links, and it's interesting, because they talk about, of course, it's even more obvious here, with this speech by Wang Yi, it's even more obvious how this South-South cooperation is framed against traditional cooperation, with northern countries, because in that traditional cooperation, Latin America, I mean, this idea of the structuralist, economic international order, in which Latin America, is more focused, on primary sector, and this creates, disadvantages for them vis-a-vis other countries who have more added value, economic activities, and it's paradoxical that China, underlines this idea that they're ready to help Latin American countries and Caribbean countries to enhance their capacity for independent development. It's an interesting concept vis-a-vis the North. Implement the strategy of economic diversification, advance industrialization, and build competitive pillar industries as soon as possible. And I said that this is paradoxical because, as we will see later on, the economic exchanges between China and Latin America mainly, abide to this traditional trade structure in which Latin America mainly exports, primary sector products and imports, secondary sector products. Okay. Now I'm moving, to the elite, elite relationships, and I think here it's important to keep this in mind. I mean, China and Latin America are very far away, and this matters, here, because most of the Latin American elites, they feel much closer to the US and to Europe than what they do, to China, not just because of geographical distance, but of course also of cultural, and historic distance. Well, traditionally, those elites, that felt closer, to the People's Republic of China were leftist elites, intellectual elites, cultural elites, or political elites, that were in they feel, close, to the left-wing ideology. They sympathize, with that. Nevertheless, due to the economic engagement of China with Latin America that I mentioned before, particularly intense since China joined the WTO, as you know, well, the pictures there, the data there is from Brazil and Chile, because these are the two main Latin American exporters to China. They are the two countries, that export more, to China. Well, in both cases, you know, these two countries, you know, they run a significant, you know, trade positive balance, you know, with China. And as you can see also in the case of Chile, you know, the Chilean exports, you know, to China are bigger than their export to the next 5 bigger destinations for Chilean exports, you know. So what I mean is that during the 21st century, the material relationship between China and Latin America have changed substantially, particularly with countries that have a very strong primary sector, you know, because as you can see here, you know, the bulk of the Latin American exports to China are from the primary sector, you know, and this has a strong relationship on what we were talking about, this elite, the influence on elites, because China has been particularly successful in influencing elites, you know, in Latin America, which are connected with this trade, you know, between their countries and China. And again, you know, since Brazil and Chile are the two main exporters, let's look at some examples, you know, from Brazil and Chile in order to see who are these elites that are more involved, you know, in promoting Chinese interests, you know, in Latin America. Well, in the case of Brazil, you know, here we have, you know, on the top left of the slide, you have like the pictures of two agriculture ministers of Brazil, you know, the current minister, Carlos Favaro, and previous minister, Teresa Cristina. And these two guys, you know, are a very good example of what we're talking about. Both of them, they were business representatives on the primary sector before becoming politicians. And, you know, for politicians, they support what is called the ruralist front, you know, in the Brazilian parliament. And both of them have played a key role, you know, in their relationship with China. When it comes to Carlos Favaro, you know, I will spend like no more than 1 minute on this, you know, another minute on the next slide, and I will finish. Okay, so or maybe, yeah, because, you know, there's only 45 minutes left and a lot of people still need to talk. Okay, so only one example here, okay? And then I move one example in the next. Okay, Ernesto Araujo, you know, one of the first foreign ministers during Bolsonaro, okay? He was sacked because he criticized Katia Abreu. Katia Abreu is also a member of this ruralist front in the parliament. She was the leader of the Commission of Foreign Affairs on the Brazilian parliament then. And Ernesto Araujo accused her of promoting Chinese interests, you know, in Brazil, related with the 5G. And Araujo was sacked because, you know, of his accusations against Katia Abreu. You know, Jair Bolsonaro decided to change, you know, Minister of Foreign Affairs because of that. And in the picture of the right, you know, there is one guy you don't know. His name is Fausto Pinato. He's also for the Ruralist Front, and he's the leader of the friendship group, of the parliamentary friendship group between Brazil and China. You know, so you can see how these ruralist interests are closely related. Here, you know, and I'm finishing now, you know, I'm sorry for taking so much time. We have this guy, he's Luis Smith. He has been ambassador for Chile in China twice. First 2010, 2014, then 2018, 2024. Again, you know, this guy, he was a very prominent business leader, you know, again, of the agro sector, you know, in Chile before being twice, you know, representative on Chile, ambassador of Chile in Brazil. I'm finishing now, and later if we have more time in the Q&A, I can elaborate more on how these guys have exerted some influence on how these elite politics work in China and Brazil. Thank you, and sorry for taking so much time.
Right, thank you, Mario. So then we have Africa, and I ask Jarek to be as brief as possible. So 10 minutes for you, because we still have a room for discussion.
So very short about Africa. I will also refer a little bit to what Mario said. In that way, I will make a kind of a comparison. So concerning the narratives, about the historical narratives, in case of Africa, it's quite often presented in the media related to the FOCA, comparing to the other formats. The main aspects which are somehow similar to what Mario said. So historical and that kind of the attempt to find a connection in the past. And there are two ways of doing this. One, the most obvious, is related to the Bandung Conference, to the Five Principles, to the engagement of China and the non-aligned movement, which obviously was also related to Africa. So they were, I would say, the most important, quite obvious, and that's not so much to comment. The interesting issues, and it's a little bit similar to what Mario said, is about the finding some of the connections to the let's say more ancient past. And it's interesting because similarly to the Latin Africa, they are somehow trying to create strange connections or not existing connections. One of the, I would say, most interesting cases in documents, it was referring to some kind of the communality of the construction of the legal system, and they refer to the Chinese legal system, but also they refer to the Hammurabi Codex, which they identify as African, which was quite interesting. Actually, in the whole discourse, there was no reference to the countries in the sub-Saharan Africa, which they're dealing the most often, and mostly they were actually referring to either to the North Africa, or as a case of the Hammurabi context, completely to something not related to. Then, of course, one more issue which is important to say in case of those historical narratives is also related to the colonialism, similarly to the Latin America. In this particular case, the small difference is that at least they have that's a little bit more real. I would say they were trying, let's say, to help, however we call this, help some African country in the fight for the independence. Usually they raise the most common well-known example of so-called Tazara railway project. So this project, which was going from the Lusaka to the Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and the idea was to, let's say, help Zambia to be independent in terms of having access to the railroad, which is not blocked, and in the way they can export copper. So that's the most common example that they are usually refer to this. Last sentence about this historical part. Interesting issue here is that usually they do not refer so often to the military support in Africa, in this post-colonial fight. I think mostly because of the two reasons. First of all, not always it's connected with the stability. I would say that rather China emphasizes now stability and harmony than fight and violence. And secondly, we have to remember, and I will follow up with this later on when I will talk a little bit about the South Africa, that quite often Chinese supported those sides which actually didn't win in Africa, in the contrast to Russia, to the Soviet Union, actually. I will come back to this. Okay, a few words about this Chinese model, or some issues which China tried to promote in Africa. I would say in this way. In Africa, they are the most vocal in this way. I think it's somehow related to the issue that actually they feel they have a strong actual power. They kind of this discursive power to put some content, which is their content, particularly their content, is somehow very strongly ideological, because of course the economic and political position comparing to the African countries is quite strong, and African countries actually they need China in terms of the money, investments, etc., etc. So that's of course mostly. So they also use the most often they use such phrases like those references to the Chinese socialism as a kind of the potential model to be followed up. Of course, even human rights, their own definition of the human rights, which of course from our side looks a bit ridiculous, but they try to promote it. And I would say in Africa it's quite often. Then obviously there are some issues which are also trying it's easier to promote a model related to those issues related to the COVID pandemic when they help some of, let's say, they announce as a big aid to the Africa in this time the poverty reduction, which they presume to be kind of the potential model, ideal model for the follow-up for the Africa, the way to fight with the poverty. And also, what is important, they're trying to promote themselves as the country who are, and they stress this quite often, who are promoting new patterns of development, new technologies, green technologies, etc., as a provider of the new model. Okay. The third issue, very shortly, related to the main areas of references. I will focus only on the economic issues and political issues here. So what I would found as quite interesting is that, obviously, I would say in case of the references to the economic issues, interesting is that most common, it's quite natural, they refer to the technology and industry. It's obviously, and it's also kind of the pattern, which I think is not only related to the African case. They're trying to find those areas of references which are most welcomed by the recipient. So they're trying to focus on those things which they can attract. So Africa needs industrialization. Africa needs new technology. Of course, they put a lot of this stuff in the documents as a kind of the promises. The another question is how much of this is put into the practice. It was actually already discussed during the main session, but in case of Africa, it's more promises than practice, especially in terms of the investment, actually. Interestingly, there is very little reference to the resources extraction. I think there are two issues here. First of all, it's obvious that China needs it. Secondly, China do not want to stress it because it doesn't look very well. And we know, probably all of us are aware about those arguments used in the public discourse about the only issue why China and Africa is to extract their resources. Yeah, so they do not naturally put it in there. There is one more thing about the political issue. Interesting, in case of Africa, there's quite often they refer to the global context, like the United Nations, etc. Very little to the bilateral context, especially in the context of the local government. In the central government, also not so much. So, from our interpretation is like this: that actually they do not treat actually the one individual African country as important enough to focus on them. They treat Africa a little bit like the one entity. It's still FOCAC, 50-something countries, yeah, and Africa, 50-something countries, and comparing to other regions, it's difficult. And also the strength of the particular country is important here. So, and also, so they focus on the more global arena, and also I think they put some global references in order to gather African support for China in the global international relations, especially United Nations. There's quite strong power, 50 countries here. So if they have their support, it's important. About this bilateral relations in case of the two countries, South Africa and Kenya, those of course in Africa is quite diverse, so there are different criteria. But it's interesting in case of those countries how they deal with the in case of the international, let's say in terms of the developing the personal network of the relation with the local elites. In case of the South Africa, they do not have that kind of the very good relation in the past, because it was similar to the case, for example, of the Angola, when in both those countries they supported the parties which didn't actually got the power after independence. So actually, Russia was supported Nelson Mandela, the most, and not China. So for the quite long period of the time, actually, those relations between China and South Africa, they were not very good. Later on, of course, they developed to a bit better way, mostly because of the economic reasons. But unfortunately, the best period of those relations was in the case of times of the President Zuma, which is also a little bit controversial because then he was accused of the many, let's say, corruption-related issues. So they are quite cautious there. They are not very. They are trying to maintain good relations with the National Congress, of course, African National Congress, but they because of the fact that in South Africa there are strong labor unions, strong NGOs. They do not want to do it too openly, not to being accused of the corruption again. So instead, for example, now of working on the central level, they focus on the local level. So they still trying to find some support, but in different way. Last sentence about South Africa. They also try to use the post-apartheid anti-Western tension. Similarly to Russia, we have to remember that, and they got quite strong support, especially in the part of the left-wing intellectuals, especially related so-called Pan-African movements, and that's probably they use it. How it will look in the future, we do not know because we just have the elections in South Africa, and actually, I think that actually the ruling party has losing the support because mostly of the economic reasons. Kenya, shortly, also a bit interesting case because Kenya is not the country which was it was actually one of the most pro-Western countries in the Sub-Saharan Africa. Although Kenya was one of the first, when Kenya got independence, they one of the first countries they established the diplomatic relation was actually China, but then those relations were spoiled because of some let's say announcements from China supporting from the general revolutionary movement, and President Kenyatta was afraid that actually they want to start the revolution in Kenya. So the relation got freeze for quite a long time. Then again, mostly because of the economic reasons, it started to develop in the 2000s. And now I would say it's also interesting because Kenya it's a country when you do not have the one party who is ruling for the long time. What is also interesting, those parties are quite, I would say, volatile. I mean, they're creating and disappearing, etc., etc. So instead, in general, the Chinese try to maintain relations with every party in Kenya, but actually the most important is a person, leader of the particular party. So they focus on the individuals, and in those central level, I would say the most interesting phenomena is that kind of the tool which they use. They try to. It's combined with the not investment with the infrastructure project. So they try to combine with the leader, and they sign the contract, for example, as the SGR, so the railroad or the ports, etc., and the idea is that this investment should be finished shortly before the election, which gives the additional power, voting power in the time of the election for the ruling party. Although we have to remember that also Kenya, because of probably maybe British, we interpret as also British heritage, have quite strong court legal system and NGOs, which actually also prevent in certain situation Chinese to conduct certain types of the, let's say, projects which are a bit controversial or because of the environmental issues, because of the potential corruption-related issues. I have no time to go into the details. Yeah, I think that's all, because then I will have to talk too much.
It's very excellent example of Lamu Port Alliance. Jarek doesn't have time to discuss it more, but we discover while talking to people in Kenya that civil society is pretty strong when it comes to influencing China's presence in Kenya. So that was really a big thing for us to see how civil society might influence China's position. Now I turn to Bartek and Central Europe.
Hello, everyone. I'm responsible for Central and Eastern Europe and the 16+1 format, which was established back in 2012. One explanatory note: why China, why the CEE, why CEE is is a part of our project of China's policies in the global south. It's because China perceives the region as a semi-periphery of the West at best, both historically and nowadays. It was hinted a couple of times by the Chinese leaders that we belong to the South-South cooperation framework, which create a basis for Chinese financial mechanism, which were offered at the beginning of the 16+1 format in 2012. 10 years on, or actually 12 years on, we can see that what China really got is a profound sense of disillusionment with China's actual performance, especially economic performance in the region. Apart from Serbia and Hungary, Hungary and Serbia, which is a part of our project, there are not many people that still believe that China can be an alternative, or at least offer substantial economic support for the region. When it comes to the quantitative analysis, we've been also, I was following the same keywords as my colleagues. Civilization and history are not important when it comes to Chinese messaging towards the region. Interestingly, civilization appears only in conjunction with the China-EU ties, which 16+1 is said to be complementary with, which gives a sense of how region is perceived by China, right? We are not a civilization region of any civilizational meaning in its own right. When it comes to five, the Bandung legacy, non-interference, it's actually absent from the Chinese messaging. And I think this is a deliberate omission because we have instances, especially during the Cold War, that China was actually actively interfering in the domestic affairs of the many countries in Central and Eastern Europe. I would, of course, name Albania and Poland, for example, in 1956, where China conditionally supported Poland vis-a-vis the Soviet Union intervention. But both are the sides of the same coin, which is the support for the centrifugal forces in Central and Eastern Europe. This is the way China was behaving in during the Cold War, and my understanding is that it is still on China's mind when it comes to relations with CEE. When it comes to China's economic development, the Chinese narratives evolves around the stability and opportunity China can bring to the Central and Eastern European states. And I think this was instrumentally used by the Chinese policymakers to infuse enthusiasm for CEE leaders to engage politically with China, because what we've seen as a result, as a post-2012 developments, is that many countries in CEE took a more neutral stance towards China when it comes to human rights and all these things that are considered sensitive for the Chinese policymakers, including Taiwan. In recent years, we see quite the opposite. We see Lithuanian example, Czech Republic, and many others. So it looks that China's attempts were not really successful, right? What really stands out from the Chinese messaging towards CE when it comes to official documents and speeches is the people-to-people ties, which, according to Li Keqiang, I think it was 2016, were described as infrastructure for developing state-to-state relations, right? So the aim is to create a critical mass of people that think positively about China by organizing training sessions, study visits for journalists, students, etc., etc. When it comes to COVID-19, this was not really this cooperation was not really developed under the multilateral framework because of the timing. 2021 was the last 16+1 summit. However, during this summit, Xi Jinping advertised Chinese vaccines as a global public good. Of course, we have Serbia and Hungary, which were showcased during this summit as a major recipients of Chinese vaccines and a proof that Chinese vaccines are of good quality. When it comes to smart city, this is a similar story as in the case with the COVID-19 assistance. There were plans to establish China-CEE coordination center, smart cities coordination center in 2019 in Romania. However, with the brewing Sino-US rivalry and COVID, this, as far as I know, these plans didn't come true. What really one can find from the documents is that 16+1 is decisively bilateral. There are not many multilateral projects. You can count, with the fingers of one hand, the multilateral project per se. And last but not least, the elite diplomacy in Poland. One should note that there were almost no interactions between Chinese embassy and Polish high-level officials in recent years. In Serbia, quite the contrary. I see Chinese embassy and one of the principal engines in cooptating Serbian officials almost on a daily basis. Chinese ambassadors are meeting with Serbian ministers, prime minister, president, etc., etc. And when it comes to China-Serbia relations, I think that apart from normative convergence built on distrust towards the Western values, etc., I think 2008 is a major turning point because this is where China this is where the West was distracted from the Western Balkans, especially when it comes to economic assistance. And this is when China came in. And this is also the year of Kosovo, right? And these two things, I think, bringing together China and Serbia until now. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bartek. Now that's my 10 minutes. I believe I will manage to discuss the issue within 10 minutes. So the first narrative towards Southeast Asia, and as was mentioned by my colleagues, we following the three categories here, that is civilization history, Bandung, 5 principles, and imperialism, colonialism, in this historical civilization part. So briefly about messaging towards Southeast Asia coming out from the Chinese leaders. What came to my mind, this is very important, that from my perspective, China is trying to play Pan-ASEANism towards Southeast Asia. They really look into promoting Asian values as something that is different from the Western type of values. So if you just look into the Chinese declarations over the years, presenting during the China-ASEAN gatherings, usually they use this Asian values, contribution of the Chinese culture, and of course Zheng He's voyages as a kind of a very symbolic that really China is a peaceful country and has a very positive intentions towards the neighbors. And of course, this is really framed within the peripheral diplomacy of the mainland China. When it comes to the historical experiences, this is also very interesting, particularly what was said by Jarek and Mario and also Bartek, that during the Maoist period, China interfered in the domestic affairs all across the world, not only Southeast Asia. And if you just talk to Thai people, they really remember this. And from this perspective, China is aware of promoting this period, while they're promoting towards the Southeast Asia the cooperation since 1991, when China seemed to contribute to the Indochina peaceful process. So this is an interesting to follow. And let me just give you a couple of examples. And of course, this Oriental culture beliefs, and usually the Chinese leaders calling here Confucius, that it's not doing to others what you don't desire ourselves, etc. So they're trying to use this narrative to persuade Southeast Asian countries that China is a very positive power in the region. Definitely, they play this argument to create a common interest with ASEAN being a part of the region. And this is also an interesting, because what we see currently, there is vis-a-vis Sino-US relations, they're trying to position themselves as a part of the region, not as external power. So, and from this perspective, they're trying to persuade this. And also, Zheng He, what we've learned from the speeches and declarations is to explain that China has never gone for expansions in its neighborhood. It's of course not true, but they use this metaphor of Zheng He stories to present themselves as non-Western-like power. This is the message. Of course, we all know the history, but still they're trying to do. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, from my perspective, they're truly referring to Sun Yat-sen Pan-Asianism concept. So they're trying to persuade we might be, and we will, to quote Sun Yat-sen here, we Asiatic must emancipate Asia. And China trying to convey this message to the Southeast Asian community. Then going through this historical narrative, very interesting what was also mentioned by Jarek. In China-Africa and China-ASEAN, the Chinese leaders mentions the peculiar leader in these pictures. That was Nelson Mandela in case of Africa, and we see here the family of Narodam. So immediately we understand from this multilateral platform that China is playing with Cambodia. If you mention the name of the political leader in your speech in a multilateral gathering, you're pointing your partner in a very direct manner. So South Africa in China, in Africa, and Cambodia in Southeast Asia. So this is an interesting dynamic here. Going through this historical, understandings, I think China need to be careful with presenting itself as a historical power, because we all know the Maoist guerrillas in Burma, in Thailand, and China's interferences in the regional affairs is really important factor. And China need to be careful here. And I will not go with history. We talked to people in Thailand about the anti-Chinese sentiments among military people, for example. It still is there. So I think this is very important. And I will not go with examples here how China interfered in Thailand, for example. When it comes to China model, this is the second part of our conversation when it comes to China's narrative. And this is the common among different platforms, starting from Latin America, through Africa, Central Europe, and ASEAN. That is people to people. And I think this really a very symbolic also, in a sense, that China trying to navigate the relationship with different multilateral gatherings through informal and relational approach. If you just recall people to people as a part of your model, as we argue in our project, definitely you're trying to persuade your partners that it's better to go in more informal way, people to people, rather with regulations, laws particularly when it comes to South China Sea. International law is not in line with China's interests, so maybe we try to convey this message to Southeast Asia. Then, interestingly, China tried to portray itself as a resilient economy, and they did two cases here: SARS 2003 and COVID pandemic. They promoted China as a really strong economy among turbulent waters of international politics. And definitely, it's very interesting, at least from my perspective, that they recall Justin Linifu as a prominent figure, and they tried using this person. They tried to persuade Southeast Asian audiences that we have a leading guy with new structural economy. It means that it's not only the CCP that is governing China. We have a big figure here. So I'm not sure to what degree it's really successful, but at least we're trying to identify what kind of argumentation they use in promotions China and China's presence in the global south. Then, interestingly, when we look into the shift in China's narrative when it comes to promoting socialism with Chinese characteristic, it's very visible, because since 2019, they really started to promote the Xi Jinping thoughts and socialism with Chinese characteristics. Before, they were really fascinated with the Singaporean model. And I see this an interesting shift here. And it's really in line with the centralization of power in China. And this is what we see from the messaging towards at least Southeast Asia, but also in other formats we also experience this. So this is an interesting, from our perspective, to understand these peculiarities when it comes to China's narratives or messaging to the global South community. Well, interestingly, this economic cooperation was also placed as part of the people-to-people. So having in mind that the Chinese overseas community is pretty strong in Southeast Asia, the people-to-people means a lot for the Chinese economic development. Going back to 1978, when the very first company that was given an export rights was CP from Thailand, originally based in Thailand, but governed by the Chinese overseas. So that's to stop here when it comes to narratives. And briefly about elite politics, it's also fascinating because China needs to adjust its strategies in different regions. As Jarek mentioned, in Kenya, election cycle is a key vehicle for China's managing the relationship with different groupings and different political parties. In Thailand, of course, the situation is slightly different because we see that the lack of party system in Thailand, as we've learned during our interviews, prevents China, of course, from exploiting party-to-party relations. That's a very natural thing. Then they need to find somebody as a middle person, because that's the logic, right? Like in Serbia, we had a government that is truly receptive and it played the middle person role. And to a certain degree, but it's very complex, and we still don't have a clue here, that we have the monarchy that might be receptive, and particularly it's really in line with the concept of network monarchy presented by McCarthy 2005. So this is part of also the conversation when China in Thailand might find a very receptive ground for informal networks, because the political system per se in Thailand is very informal. And what we've learned here is Princess Mahachakri Shirinhorn, and I will not go into details, but she's really part of, middle person strategy, looking for influencing the domestic politics through middle person. And that's in Thailand. And of course, we have the Chinese overseas community there. But as I said, China needs to be very careful because of the anti-Chinese sentiments. Easily, the Thai people might go against when they really recognize China cross the red line. China crosses the red line. So from this perspective, I think this is interesting. Plus, what we also learned during our trip to Bangkok, that China would quote is very good at recognizing the weather forecast. We know when the rain comes, and we are ready for the storm, and we can easily choose the pattern. So this is also because we did not touch the agency from the global south, but it's also important to look at different countries, how they perceive China, etc. So, well, Thailand, as we can acknowledge, it's very good at recognizing the weather forecast and go with the wind, don't go against the wind. And I will not discuss what we've learned about Americans in Thailand, but anyway. So now Cambodia, and here it's an interesting dynamic, very similar to Serbia, I would say, that the middle person is the government. That's because of China is seen as a regime provider, regime security provider. And from this perspective, Cambodia is very receptive to have a very close relations with China, because that's monarchy plus the government, and what we've learned in Cambodia also, they really are pretty much in favor of cooperating with the Chinese Communist Party, because they need a patron. In a sense that they need a patron to provide a security for the regime. So the Hun Sen and Hun Manet, I think they're really very good middle person in the region. That's why, by the way, Narodom's family was mentioned by Li Keqiang 2015. And I stop here, and I believe we will have a Q&A session now. So who's ready? Who'd like to ask a question? We have 4 questions in a row. So I will give you a mic. So who was first? I don't know, maybe I will go from my right side, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Half commentary, half question, because I can't help myself being a little cheeky here. Dominik saw that I was smiling throughout your presentation. Basically, we probably both realize that a lot of Wang Yi's or Xi Jinping's historical narrative is just pure bollocks. And in this sense, I won't even get into the details of those historical distortions, right? Because I would have to be cruel. But basically, because there is a lot of historical appropriation being done, and in Latin America, this would be probably more a question to Mario and to Jarek and to Dominik, because this, I don't know, probably I won't mention the brief visit in Legnica in 1241, right? But in this sense, I'm wondering about this, because I can understand that in terms of political elites, this very hand-picked political elites and the business elites, basically they do not care how true this is. Right. But in terms of epistemic communities, from what I got, you have been interviewing people, right? And you were talking with scholars. And the question is, do they buy this? The basic, do they care? If they talk, about, if they try to appropriate the Manila galleon just because, some Chinese immigrants bought parts of the cargo loads in order to transport Chinaware to Acapulco, is this actually, the thing that can be conveyed as Chinese, in terms of Pan-Asianism? This is a Japanese cultural product. And the Chinese suddenly, Saika Conference 2014, Xi Jinping comes out and basically speaks like, I don't know, Kodera Kenkichi, or basically, or Okakura Kakuzo, right? And so in this sense, this is ridiculous, and the question is notorious, and the question if this ridicule and notoriety is actually working. This is my question.
I would like to also come back to your interviews and link a bit the keynote speech with your presentations. And Simon Curtis, one of the focus points of his speech was the material presence of China, in particular cities and countries. And coming back to your interviews, have you seen the link between those narratives and the material presence of China, or that people stress this material presence in their neighborhood? Is it somehow linked, and is it visible that China changed the reality around those people? Thank you.
Thank you. David O'Brien from Jagiellonian University. You mentioned briefly elections. This is the year of elections. Half the world's population is going to vote at some point, even more now when France announced last week. And Pew Research recently published findings that 1/3 of under 30-year-olds in the United States get most of their news from TikTok. And I'm wondering, has social media, particularly Chinese-owned social media, played a role in your research, particularly in the Global South, in this year when China will have a big interest in many of these elections? Thank you.
And my question is connected, mainly to Latin America. In the December of last year, newly elected President Javier Milei renounced the invitation to the BRICS group. And I'm wondering if it's the sign of a bigger shift in Latin America and, well, Global South, or maybe it's just a singular case of a more sovereign policy. Thank you.
Mario, that you are the first now. Please answer the questions.
Okay, so I will try to answer very quickly in order. Do they buy this? I think the only thing they buy is that China has historical credentials, in confronting U.S. unilateralism. So the part, of the Latin American population and elites, that could see the U.S. playing a lower role, in the region. So they feel, this kind of connection with China. But I think that's the only part, they actually buy. Material presence of China. Yes, actually, I think that's key, and actually, what a lot of people said, in Latin America, is that when talking about narratives and the connection between narratives, and the material dimension, is that, for example, with the US, they have a lot of negative narratives about Latin America. You don't do this, you don't do that, particularly when it comes to China. But China, besides the narrative, it has actual projects, actual investment, so this material presence, is one of the key points, for China in for example, in Brazil and in Chile, from the positive perspective. Social media, at least, when it comes to the research we have conducted so far, we have put more focus on traditional media, than in social media, and we haven't presented about this. But something very interesting for me is that traditional media in Brazil and in Chile, they quite frequently reproduce narrative from the Chinese domestic media without any critical analysis, they just reproduce it. But as I said, we focus much more on traditional media than in social media, Sorry, the last question. I brought my reply here, but I couldn't understand my own handwriting. Sorry, so I miss it now. Sorry for that. I was running out of space in the paper, so I read it down so small that I miss it now. Sorry for that. Sorry.
So afterwards, we will ask colleague to repeat the question, Mario, especially for you. Bartek, please.
try to be as much concise as possible. So I think we can connect these two questions. What China, how China is seen in the global south, especially in Africa, is that China is financing the projects, especially infrastructural projects, which no other country is willing to cover. No matter it's credit based, it's or loan based, it's not a aid per se. But coming back to Simon Curtis' lecture, it creates physical presence. These infrastructural projects are visible, and I think this material presence can be utilized for political influence, because a African leader, be it in Kenya, Kenyatta, can present the public that because we cooperate with China, we have a modern SGR, we have a modern highway in the center of the capital, which, by the way, not many Kenyans can afford to travel because you have to pay like $15 or something, which is like a huge amount of money for the locals. But this is the fact. And contrary to the Western projects, which, for example, support local civil societies, medical services, etc., they're not seen. They're not that visible, right? Physically visible. And the second thing, when it comes to Chinese media, we have not been really following the Chinese social media, but in Africa we've learned that, for example, there is a per-pay view. It's not Star TV, which is present in 30 plus countries in Africa, and it gained huge popularity in recent years because it broadcasts Chinese TV shows and Chinese media productions in local languages. And this is a big advantage of China when it comes to rivalry for, or be it like soft power, right? When it comes to rivalry with Western countries. And M-Pesa, I think Jarek can add a few words for M-Pesa.
Okay, questions. If the people buying, if the allies are buying some, okay, I would say in case of the Africa, they might partly, I don't know for sure if they're buying, sometimes they're using this. Definitely they're using those narratives about the independence fight, post-colonialism idea, the idea that China and Africa having rather colonized than colonizing, so that they are somehow using. I would say in South Africa, I have the impression that some of I've already mentioned those left-wing intellectual elites, some of them, they are really buying this. I have the impression. We have been on the Pan-African conference, and some of them, they are really, I would say, too emotional, and that's why they are buying this. Because, of course, we have to remember that in South Africa there is a steep emotional problems of the apartheid. It's ended not so time ago. So those young allies still have this very strong anti-Western sentiments. So in my opinion, they are in that way most prone to buying that kind of stuff. Material issues similar, yes, like Africa's. Just one sentence here. I would say, similar actually to Latin America. I would say that most of the African allies are actually educated in the West. They are not educated. Okay, some of them are educated in Russia. Some of them, not so many of them in China. But most of them, they still think about going to West. West is the top priority actually, and then most of them are educated in the West, but they told me quite often, okay, we would love to cooperate with the West, but we have no choice. We have to cooperate with China because of the reason which already my colleagues mentioned. Concerning the social media, as my colleagues already said, we haven't been actually investigating this issue because of the different reasons. We cannot gather all the data which are available, but I would say I do not think that actually in the case of the TikTok there is a potential risk for Africa. I don't want to say that they do not use TikTok, but I would say the majority of the, let's say, local people actually, the content of the African TikTok is not politically related actually. So I do not see here any. Okay, I know that some algorithm can be modified, but on the other hand, I do not see any kind of the potential danger here.
Well, thank you for all questions. Regarding Pan-Asianism, that's true. I mean, the Chinese are not only following Japan when it comes to Pan-Asianism, but following Japanese when it comes to developmental model and so on and so forth. So it's true, but still they try to use for their own purposes. When it comes to the material presence and narratives, it's an interesting question because usually words are not really in line with deeds. And what we see in Cambodia, particularly in Sihanoukville, there is a special economic zone, true, but this is a casino city. This is a really money laundering place for the Chinese officials, corrupted people, and mafia. So it wasn't declared by Li Keqiang or President Xi in front of ASEAN people. But what we've learned in Cambodia, and it's really important to recognize the domestic transition inside the country, that is anti-corruption campaign. And what we've learned, that the whole story of Casino City in Sihanoukville started with the anti-corruption campaign. So you know the story. I mean, when it comes to social media and TikTok and stuff, what we also recognize that because China is really good at approaching elites and policymakers from the highest echelon of the leadership, right? So they really were learning how to approach the lower stratas of the society. And TikTok might influence, but might influence also tensions between the government and the people. And what we've learned also with this informal networks, China created to some extent in Kenya, for example, and also in South Africa, tensions between labor unions and the government, between non-governmental organizations and the government. And then there was a case in South Africa, as I remember, the Huawei story, when it comes to the labor unions activities, anti-Huawei activities in South Africa and Lamu Port Alliance I mentioned. But briefly, because we need to finish in a minute, let me just summarize this narrative part, because I think this is truly, we discuss history a lot, but history does not matter. If you compare the four categories, that is history, economy, politics, and China model, history is not present. In Central Europe, is only three words per document. So it's nothing. In FOCAC, it's almost 10 words per document. Comparing to China model, for example, in FOCAC, when you have 80 words per document, referring to China model. Interestingly, because usually we see China as an economic power, that's true. But when it comes to Central Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, what we identify in our overall research is that politics is more important when it comes to relations with Southeast Asia and Latin America. What is the meaning? China is a maritime power, or tries to be a maritime power. And Tomek calling me to stop, and thank you very much. Lunch is waiting. So thank you very much for all questions, comments, and, well, thank you.